Well, we're looking at the book of Esther, because that's what's up in the narrative lectionary. And the book of Esther is quickly becoming one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. In fact, there's a guy, a Jewish historian, a rabbi, who said, and if you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that they're commemorating all of their historical events with some sacrifice and usually a feast. And a Jewish rabbi, who I think is still alive, said you can sum up all of Jewish history in 3 phrases. They tried to kill us. They failed. Let's eat. So that's Jewish history, and actually the Jewish feast of Purim, comes from the book of Esther. And so rather than try to explain the whole book and then talk about one verse, I found something that I want you to watch that will help you see and understand, I hope, the whole book of Esther.
Esther's story takes place during the years of the Jewish exile, around 470 BC. Now the Jews had been defeated by Babylon, which meant they were exiled from their homeland and taken as slaves. But later, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. So now, the Jews found themselves under the rule of the Persian king, Xerxes. That's where our story begins. King Xerxes decided he was going to throw a party. And this wasn't your standard cookies and punch type of party. This party lasted for 7 days and included all manner of lavish feasting and drinking. Now on the last day, the king decided to show off his queen, who was very beautiful. But when he called for her to come to the feast, she refused. This greatly angered the king, and not only the king, but his counselors and noblemen as well, because they were thinking, if the queen treats the king this way, wives everywhere are going to start disrespecting their husbands. They're going to be mouthing off, refusing to change the baby. They're not going to cook the falafel for dinner. It's going to be chaos. So the king declared that the queen was no longer the queen, which meant that he needed to find a new one. Now, if you're an all-powerful male in the ancient world, what better way to find a new wife than to parade every beautiful single woman in the land through your palace? So that's what he did. Among the hundreds of women sent to the palace was a girl named Esther. Esther was secretly a Jew, and she was also an orphan raised by her uncle Mordecai. And though she was essentially the lowest possible social class, the Lord was with Esther, and she was a beautiful and graceful woman. When she was brought to the palace, she found favor among all the king's staff, and ultimately the king himself, who chose her to be queen. Sometime later, Esther's uncle Mordecai was sitting at the city gate when he overheard 2 men plotting to kill the king. Mordecai quickly relayed this to Esther, who told the king, who promptly solved the problem. Even though he saved the king's life, Mordecai was never recognized for what he did. And sometime later, he found himself in trouble when a man named Haman rose to power. Haman was the king's second in command, and whenever Haman walked through the streets, everyone was ordered to bow down before him. But Mordecai, being a Jew and a follower of God, refused to bow to Haman. When Haman found out about it, he was enraged. In fact, he was so enraged that he plotted to kill not only Mordecai, but every single Jew in the empire, women and children included. By Haman's influence, the king sent out a decree that ordered all Jews to be executed and their property taken. When Mordecai found out about it, he begged Esther to approach the king and ask him to change his mind. But Esther knew that if she were to approach the king without being summoned, she could, by law, be put to death. Esther was in torment, but finally, after much fasting and praying, she decided to approach the king, even if she should perish. When the king saw her standing before him, he loved her and invited her to speak. "What do you wish, Esther?" the king asked. Esther replied, "I would ask that the king and Haman come to a feast that I shall prepare, The king was delighted, as was Haman, and together they feasted. Toward the end of the meal, the king asked Esther, "What is it that you wish? Anything you want will be granted to you, up to half my kingdom." Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to another feast that I will prepare, and there I will answer the king's question." Haman left the palace happy that day, but on his way home, he noticed Mordecai at the gate, and was reminded of Mordecai's refusal to bow to him. Haman's mood darkened. He decided to have a gallows built on which Mordecai would be hanged the following day. That night, the king couldn't sleep. So he ordered the book of records to be brought and read to him. When the account of Mordecai's warning of the plot to kill the king was read, the king asked, "What have we done to honor Mordecai for saving my life?" "Nothing, your majesty," replied the servant. So the king called for Haman, and when he arrived, the king asked, "What should I do for someone I want to honor?" Haman thought he was thinking of him, and he said, "You should put your royal robes on him, and a crown, and let him ride your horse through the streets so that everyone will know that this is the man the king honors." The king thought that was a great idea, and he said, "Perfect! Go and get Mordecai and do exactly what you have just said. In fact, you can be the one to lead the horse around." Soon after this, the day of Queen Esther's feast arrived. After they had finished eating, the king again asked Esther, "What is it that you wish? Anything you want will be granted to you, up to half my kingdom." Esther replied, "O king, if it please you, all I ask is that my life and the life of my people be spared. For I am a Jew, and it has been decreed that all Jews in the empire should be annihilated." When he heard this, the king was furious. "Who would do such a thing to my queen?" he shouted. "Haman," replied Esther. "And furthermore, he has built a gallows to hang Mordecai, who once saved the king's life." The king replied, "Then let Haman be hanged on it." And so it was. Haman was executed on the gallows, and a new decree was issued, saving the lives of the Jews. Esther and Mordecai were honored and spent the rest of their days serving the king.
There you have it. The book of Esther in 6 minutes and 52 seconds. A lot of people through history have thought that the book of Esther should not be in the Bible. And you're probably saying, what? Why is that? In fact, I believe, well, I'll have to look at this, but, Luther was famous for saying, well, this book is not that great because it doesn't talk about Christ, and that book is not that great. And I think Esther was one of the books that Luther was not sure should be in the Scriptures. And down through history, there have been a lot of people who didn't think it should be in the Scriptures. Do you know why? Because in the whole book, it never mentions God's name. In fact, it never uses any of the names of God in that whole book. And you'll notice that in the video, they couldn't refrain from bringing God into it. But God is never mentioned as an actor or even in the background in the book of Esther. The prayer is not mentioned. None of the temple is mentioned. Jerusalem isn't mentioned. The Holy Land isn't mentioned. The only thing of a spiritual practice that's mentioned is fasting. And fasting was a common spiritual practice to a lot of people in those days. So there's virtually nothing in the book, other than the fact that they're Jews, that would say that this is a book that's about God and about God's work. So a lot of people have thought, well, we shouldn't have it in there. I suspect that also part of the reason has been that Esther was a woman in charge who saved her people, and you have that side of things going. But I think that there are two good reasons to have the book of Esther in the Bible. Not like it's up to me to say one way or the other. I'm just saying I think that there's two good reasons why it should be there, and this is a lot of people agree with me on this. Number one, and this will be the whole message today, other than that little vignette on Esther. Number one is the providence of God. The providence of God. That whole book, even though God is never mentioned, and even though nothing about Israel is ever mentioned, it just seems to be on the surface a tale of an oppressed people living in a foreign land, and they're miraculously delivered. Not even miraculously. You wouldn't even say miraculously. They're delivered by the actions of some people that were part of those people. Esther is a book for everyday, ordinary Christians like you and me. Even though God is not a named presence or actor, it's obvious that he's active behind the scenes in the book. Think of all the coincidences that happen in that book. You know, usually when I talk about coincidences, I talk about them as God incidences. Think about all the coincidences that happen in the book of Esther. In the first place, Esther, who is a poor exile living in a foreign country, becomes queen. In fact, Esther is an orphan. So she's a poor, exiled orphan. And yet she becomes queen of Persia, of the Persian Empire. Now that's an amazing thing to have happen. That never happened in those days. That kind of thing is just an amazing coincidence. Then, on top of that, Mordecai overhears, just happens to be at the right place at the right time to overhear a plot on the king's life. And so he tells Esther, who's the queen, she warns the king is saved, but nothing is ever done about it. Nobody ever rewards Mordecai for it. Then, one night, the king can't sleep. So he says, bring in the royal records and read them to me. Of course, that would put you right to sleep, right? It's like having the IRS come in. Read me my 1040s for the last 10 years. You'd be right to sleep. But so the king is laying there, and he's having this record read, and it reads the place where, lo and behold, Mordecai saved his life. And he says, what was ever done for Mordecai? First he says, nothing. So he says, we got to honor him. So they go to honor him. Now, Haman, on the other hand, has hated Mordecai, and he builds a gallows for Mordecai that he's going to hang Mordecai on. And yet, what happens in the end, as you followed through there, is that in the end, Mordecai gets hung on those gallows himself. And all of the Jews, against all probability, are saved from annihilation. So you see God's, and that's all without mentioning God, without mentioning prayer, without mentioning anything religious going on. It's just people making connections and living out their lives. I think that's a good example of God's providence, of the sovereignty of God being in charge, even in a place in a foreign land where people don't acknowledge him. God is in charge. His providence is working out his plans in every single circumstance of the lives of his people. I think we can count on that. God is completely hidden. He's not in the picture. He's not officially worshipped. They're not in a place where the worship of God is official or anything like that. And yet, God is completely in control. He's providentially in charge of the kingdoms of this world. I think that should be a heartening thing, particularly at this time of the year. A lot of times you hear people talking about, and sometimes ranting about, we've kicked God out of the schools. Really? You don't kick God anywhere. In the first place, God is always there. And yet sometimes we act as if we human beings, we puny little human beings, have the ability to tell God where to go and what to do, like kicking them out of the schools. It's not possible. We hear sometimes about a war on Christmas. We hear all kinds of people talking about how there's some sort of a conspiracy to get rid of Christmas. Come on. You can't get rid of it. You might make it more difficult for people to celebrate it. You can't get rid of it because you can't get rid of God. The promises of God in the Scripture tell us that until the world ends, there's going to be a witness to what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. I think sometimes the people that get all upset about those things really don't have a fully biblical Christian faith. What they really have is a veneer of Christian faith over a lifestyle that they want to preserve, and they feel like they have to be the ones to preserve it. But they don't have a fully Christian faith in God, because Esther shows us that even in a foreign land, even where God isn't worshipped, even where other gods are worshipped, God can take care of his own. And he does the same thing today. And so I think that that's one reason why we should keep the book of Esther. Not again, there's no movement to take Esther out of the Bible. You know? I'm just saying, people have said that down through the centuries. What's the point? God isn't even mentioned. I think it's great that God isn't mentioned and that God is still there working. Of course, that's a very Presbyterian Calvinist thing to say. So, anyway, that's the reason, that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second reason why Esther, I think, belongs in the Scriptures is because it points to Christ. One of the reasons why Christians look in the Old Testament is because Jesus, in his life and in his teaching, took everything in the Old Testament and oriented it around himself. Every Sunday, when we have the Lord's Supper, I always mention the amazing chutzpah of Jesus to take the central feast of the life of the people of God, the central thing that they did, the Passover celebration, and at that feast, he turns the whole thing on himself. He takes the whole feast and bends it back on him. And Christians began to say, that's exactly right. That's the right thing to do. And so when you read the Old Testament, you should be looking everywhere for what theologians call types of Christ, pictures of Christ. And what better picture of Christ could you have than Esther? That may be another reason why people want Esther out of the Bible. Get uncomfortable when women are a picture of Jesus. So they look, anyway, that's reading into other people's thoughts. Esther is a type of Christ. Esther is an outsider. She's a foreigner. She's not a Persian. She's not of that world. And yet she gets taken into that world. She's born as a poor, orphan girl who has no standing in that society. And yet she becomes the central figure of that society, and she lays down her life at great personal risk to herself. When I say she lays down her life, she puts her life at risk. She goes to the king when it's against the law to do so. She breaks the law to be faithful, goes to the king, and consequently, putting her life at risk, saves her people from perishing. She's willing. That's why I had that passage read that we had read. Actually, that's why that's in the narrative lectionary. Verse 16. I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. That's a picture of Jesus. The law can't save us. We have to be saved by someone else, and that someone else is Christ. There's no salvation available through the law, as the whole rest of the New Testament tells us. Esther is a picture of that. Esther is like a blinking light in the Old Testament that says, Jesus, 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 look here, this is what Jesus is going to be like. When Jesus tells people that the whole Scriptures speak about him, that's one of the places where he gets that. That's a type, a foreshadowing, a pre-paradigm. Write that one down. A pre-paradigm of what Christ is going to be like. And so for those two things alone, Esther is a valuable, valuable book. In fact, I would say that it's almost because of the fact that it's like a parable, it's a story, like Jesus tells parables to do his teaching, it's a story that gets into your mind and your imagination and your heart almost unbeknownst to you, and then breaks out in all kinds of new meaning and glory reflected in what Christ does. So as you come to the Lord's Supper today, remember Esther. And even more importantly, receive all that Christ has done for us when he did lay down his life at great personal cost to himself, so that we might be remade in God's image, so that we might have new life in him as we receive the assurance of forgiveness, as we receive hope for the future, as we receive a pardon from the judgment that was coming upon us. All of those things are figured for us here. And I would say and encourage you to put your hope in the Lord and to receive by faith all that he offers to us in the Lord's Supper. Let's close in prayer.